and then we will only allow to stream when the timer goes up.
In the last few days has really honed in on, well, the key of the teaching. One is to be very clear on what we're looking for in practical terms, which really means dropping our ideas of what we're looking for. And this is what beliefs are. We don't even realize that it's a belief until it gets seen as a belief. So we can believe something and not realize that it might not be right. So a belief is really assuming the concept that we hold to be truth, to be true, absolutely. And it's usually only once we see the relativity of that concept that we hold that we realize, oh, maybe it's not as absolute as I thought. So a good example of this is, you might believe in a certain political party. Your parents followed a particular political party, and all of your friends follow a particular political party, and you do, and you have this idea that they are the bee's knees. No other party will ever be what you will be able to follow. And then at some point in time, this particular political party does something that really doesn't sit with you. And at that point, you question your allegiances, and you might actually find yourself voting for another political party or hoping another political party comes in. And you look at that and you go, wow, I never thought, when we believe that this is my political party and my view, at that time we didn't really think it would change, because the nature of belief is to think that this is true, that what I believe in and the idea that this political party is going to serve me best is true. And it's only when there's a big shift that we realize, oh, it wasn't truth. That was relative. It was valid at that point in time. And so in this spiritual search, we can often start off, depending on the path that we're on, being given a concept of what we're looking for. Oneness, for example, or non-duality. Unconditional love. Global awakening. All sorts of concepts. And well, the one we have is to be a better person. That's something that often in spirituality is what's being sought, not only in spirituality, but in all of life. I want to be a better person, and we think that's the answer. And that can serve a purpose, and the process of this path, or the process of this unfolding of life, and in particular the unfolding of the spiritual seeking, is magical. It really, in my view, how I see it, is it's part of the evolution of life. It's as magical as the growing of an organism. It happens automatically. We didn't need to ensure that our legs grew properly and that our eyes were growing properly. It happens, and it happens amazingly. All of life really is happening amazingly. And the spiritual search is no different. And so when we get given certain concepts along the way and we believe them, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It serves its purpose. So in fact, we might be forced to believe them by the process in order for certain things to happen. And then at some point, we might see that maybe that's not as true as it seemed. So I'm talking a lot. Really, we're getting down to the point is that this teaching, and we've been talking about it a lot, says let's start with making sure we have a good concept, an accurate concept, one that applies to us, of what we're really looking for. And so that's a question to ask. What am I really looking for? And someone who has been seeking on a particular path will often say, I'm looking for, and then essentially tell you what the teaching has been promoting. So I'm looking for non-duality or oneness, could be it. Or I'm looking for truth or the absolute. Now, the teaching includes that because teaching is a methodology. And it's, as I said, it's a very well-defined process. So it does what it needs to do at particular places. But in this teaching, we're saying, now let's be practical about it. Let's drop this idea. Why do you want oneness? Why do we want success when that's what we were looking for in some part in our life? Why do we want a soulmate if that was what we were looking for at some part of our life? And when we're really honest, I want these things because I think they will make me happy. And when we look at what drives us to seek various things, we find it's a sense of something missing in this moment, a sense of discontent or uncomfortableness with life. That's what drives the movement to seek something. And if we feel into this feeling of discontent that's driving the seeking, we could actually say, this is my unhappiness. And that's why we're seeking various outcomes, because we believe the outcome will eliminate the unhappiness. When I get that outcome, then the feeling I have at the moment will change. And so this is a little bit of an exploration to become very clear on what I'm really looking for. The suggestion is what we're all looking for is happiness. We have all sorts of ideas how that happiness is to be found, where it's to be found. But ultimately, we're looking for happiness. And even though we've got that wrong, and we think that happiness is to be found in outcomes and pleasure, and that happiness is maybe a feeling, excited feeling, or a blissful feeling, or just whatever, a joyful feeling. Even though we've got the understanding of what happiness is wrong, it's not necessarily the case that we're not actually looking for happiness. I'd put forward the fact that we are looking for happiness. We just don't know what that is. And often when we have these discussions, or sometimes someone will say, well, I'm not sure I'm looking for happiness. I think I'm looking for truth. I think I'm looking to know myself. But why? Only because there is a sense that something is missing now. So really what we could say is, I'm looking for the end of this sense that something's missing. And I think I might get it by finding union with God, or by finding truth, or by knowing myself. But really, let's come down to the lowest common denominator. So you're looking for the end of this sense of uncomfortableness or sense that something's missing. And if we do start from that starting point, actually, to be honest, if I drop all my ideas of what I think I should be looking for, I just want to be happy. If we keep it focused on that, then we can start dealing with that issue. Because we can look at what our unhappiness is and be very practical about that and see it in daily living for ourselves. And we can then maybe start to get a better idea of what this happiness really looks like. And the assertion here, this is a concept that's put forward. Remember, they're all concepts. They are just pointers for you to verify and consider for yourself based on your own experience. The assertion here is that what we're really looking for is happiness in this life. And that happiness turns out to be something very simple. Peace of mind. Happiness through peace of mind. Continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in. And I can tell you from my own experience that it's only when peace of mind on a continuous, unbroken basis exists that seeking stops. And so from a very practical feedback standpoint, I know for myself what I was always looking for was this peace of mind, this continuous peace of mind. Whenever I looked for something else and got anything else, the seeking continued. And it was only when peace of mind, regardless of circumstance, settled in, which is actually an attitude to life, an attitude that I don't create, but an attitude that my makeup is naturally able to have when certain beliefs have been dissolved. When that attitude is there, attitude towards whatever happens in the flow of life, then there's this sense that I am complete regardless of what's happening. So, if happiness for the human being is not the gaining of anything, not a feeling, not a sense of pleasure, because pleasure is going to come and go, if it's just the absence of an uncomfortableness, if it's just the absence of a certain movement that the body is programmed to create, which once again is attitudinal to circumstance. So circumstance, the flow of life, is only ever pleasure or pain. And our unhappiness is not the pleasure or pain itself. That's always going to be there. If our unhappiness was the pleasure or pain itself, then we'd have to hang our hat up and say, happiness isn't available, because life is always going to be pain from time to time. So if we become clear, the flow of life is always pleasure and pain, no escaping that. This transformation doesn't suddenly make us have special powers where everything is going to be pleasurable. Ramesh used to say, just tongue-in-cheek, it's not going to allow us to be in two places at once. It's not going to give us special powers. It's definitely not going to mean that whenever we're looking for a parking spot, one's magically going to appear. That's the flow of life. Pleasure sometimes, pain at others. And our unhappiness is our attitude to the pleasure or pain as it arises. Attitude meaning what we think it means about us. And our happiness is also attitudinal. They're two different attitudes. The attitude of unhappiness is the attitude whereby we assume that the pleasure and pain in life is something that directly affects who I am. So it's a belief. Because we come to see that actually what I am at my core is never affected by circumstance. So that's the first part of the attitude that creates unhappiness. And the second part is the belief that I am the doer and the other is the doer. That means when life unfolds in a painful way and we think that that is an attack on who we are, we find someone to blame. Ourself or the other. seeing them as a separate independent entity that chose of their own volition to act this way and deliver the pain, which I see as my unhappiness at that point, deliver that unhappiness to me. So then I have to hate them, or I have to hate myself for having performed in such a way that delivered an outcome that essentially was my unhappiness. That's the view, that it was my unhappiness. The other attitude is just the dissolving of those beliefs. It's not the taking on of a new set of beliefs. So it's not taking on a new belief that says, oh, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. I am the doer, I am not the doer, and the other is not the doer. That is what happens in the interim, and those concepts are there simply to contrast, to uproot the existing beliefs, which is the attitude that creates suffering, just to undo those in order for, at some point, both those sets of beliefs, or, well, hopefully the new concepts don't get turned into beliefs, they just get treated as concepts that can attack the ingrained belief. Once the new concepts have attacked the ingrained beliefs, then the space is left empty. And what we find is that the body, with the absence of the old belief system of doership and attachment to outcome, the body still functions in life, still performs well at some things and not very well at other things. So outcomes are pleasurable sometimes and painful at other times. And yet, this automatic reaction of judging what is happening as appropriate or inappropriate relative to who I am stops. The automatic reaction that used to be there of blaming the other because they were seen as a separate independent doer no longer arises, because life has been seen differently in a very practical way. The other has been seen to be part of the unfolding of life, meaning intrinsically one with what is happening, and not some independent entity that makes its own decisions in each moment, unaffected by anything else, but rather an entity that is never separate from everything that came before, and never separate from everything that exists in this moment. And therefore the decisions that get made, and decisions do get made, choices get made in each moment, are seen to be a happening according to the unfolding of life, and not the doing of a particular individual that is independent and autonomous. This is the big difference. So the other will still deliver pain to us. We will still deliver pain to the others from time to time, not intentionally, but as part of the unfolding story of life. So this attitude of seeing the other as not the doer, meaning not a separate independent entity using their own volition, doesn't mean we're not going to be hurt by the other. It just means that it's not going to be seen as personally as it used to. It's going to be seen that life is a predetermined story, a creation that is unfolding moment after moment, exactly as it's destined to unfold, according to God's will, we could say. Source at rest has burst into action and has become source in movement. Consciousness at rest has actualized. It's gone from its potential into its actuality. It has become the manifestation, from the beginning of time to the end of time, and everything in between. An amazing creation, so vast and amazing and intricate that our mind, which is simply our intellect, which is simply part of that story, could never understand the complexity and the completeness of the universe. But what we can see is that life is an amazing creation. And everything that's happening in each moment is part of that amazing creation. So you lock your keys in the car, part of the amazing creation, destined to happen. And the feeling of self-hatred, should that arise, or the feeling of humor, having seen that just before a very important meeting, you've locked your keys in the car and can't get there on time, you might laugh at the hilarity of life, if you're lucky enough to be able to not take it too seriously. Or you might judge yourself as clumsy and unworthy. You might blame your partner for having taken the spare keys from the little hiding spot in the car and not put them back, if that's the case. But whatever happens, whatever reaction happens, also part of the story of life. And if we can start to see all of life as a happening, that in itself is a witnessing of life, a witnessing of the emotion that arises as a happening, the witnessing of the moving of the body as a happening. So we can witness the fact that the body took the things out of the car, closed the door, and just as the door was about to slam closed, the thought arises, the keys. And all of that can be witnessed as a happening. So if we witness the flow of life as pleasure or pain, or if we understand the flow of life as a continuous flow of pleasure sometimes and pain at others, we start to witness this instead of being so heavily involved with it. Simply bringing attention to something means it starts to be seen, maybe differently to how it used to be seen before. And this idea of seeing life as a flow of pleasure and pain, the idea of understanding that our suffering arises in different forms, all of this means that we're able to start recognizing this when it happens. So we stub our toe, there is still the pain, and then the thought might arise, this is pain in the moment. And so just the act of labeling it can mean witnessing. Now that might sound strange, because in a different teaching, a different path, labeling is actually one of the things we have to stop doing. And the reason that in a different path we're told to stop labeling is because the attachment to pleasure is so ingrained in us that one of the ways of undoing attachment to pleasure is to stop labeling things as pleasure or pain. Now, the fact is that if we stop labeling something as pleasure or pain, doesn't change it from still being biologically either pleasurable or painful. So if you stub your toe, what's really happening when we're told not to label is it's cutting off the judging of the pain, because automatically inside of us there's an attachment to pleasure and an aversion of pain. That's what seems to be put in place, this belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure or pain, and therefore there's an attachment to pleasure being there, and an attachment in its reverse form, so an aversion of pain being present. And because that's ingrained in us, some teachings won't speak about the attachment. They'll just ask us to stop labeling certain things as pleasure or pain. It doesn't change them from being pleasure or pain, but it means that the brain then doesn't go into its judgment. So if we can make it clear that the flow of life is always pleasure and pain, and if the intellect can come to understand its happiness is never to be found in pleasure or pain, understand that the problem is the belief that my happiness is to be found in pleasure or pain, then we don't need to start denying the pleasure or pain in the flow of life, because the ingrained attachment can start to dissolve. And if the ingrained attachment starts to dissolve, we can call something pain. And then the intellect itself says, and this is not an attack on who I am. This pain is not an attack on my happiness. If we don't have that conditioning, if we don't have that distinction in life, then the other approach is to say, don't label anything as pleasure or pain. Just allow it to be what it is without labeling it. And then that cuts off the attachment, or it cuts off the judgment. It doesn't undo the attachment. So it only works for as long as we keep not labeling life as pleasure or pain. And the fact is that life, whether we label it or not, still biologically is still pleasurable or painful. You put your hand under hot water and you don't need to label it as hot water, you don't need to label it as pain. There is a biological sensation that is going to feel pleasurable relative to our biological preferences, or painful, depending on the nature of the experience, relative to biological preferences. So, as we look at the human suffering, and we start to see that this attitude of doership is based on a belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and the belief that I am the doer and the other is the doer, and we start to get given pointers, concepts, that allow us to investigate the validity of these beliefs for ourselves, based on our own investigation of our own life experience. Hopefully we start to find that as we investigate, we see more and more that these beliefs are not accurate. And as it's seen for ourselves that these beliefs are not accurate, they start to dissolve. They start to be believed less. The beliefs are often heavily ingrained, and so they will probably still arise, but they will be witnessed as the arising of ingrained beliefs that are not accurate. And the seeing of that, the seeing of the blame that might still arise, but knowing that it is a movement based on a deeply ingrained false belief, allows a witnessing of that blame to be there. And in time, the beliefs get completely uprooted, and then we find ourselves in life faced with circumstance, as we always have been, pleasurable sometimes, painful at others, and that automatic reaction of uncomfortableness with circumstance doesn't arise. And what that creates is space for us to recognize our very primal sense of existence. We could call it the consciousness functioning through the body. And we might find ourselves resting in that presence more and more often, appreciating the presence that we are in this moment right now. In every moment that exists, it's always a moment or an experience experienced now. And to the extent that the suffering has quietened down, there is a space in which that sense of existence, that presence, is recognized and is known based on a direct feedback to be self-contenting, self-fulfilling, and the source of my happiness. As that happens more and more, we have the direct experience for ourselves that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. My happiness is actually innate with my own existence. So we could start off receiving a concept that says this essence is the essence of source functioning through the body. Source has linked to the body and is functioning through the body as personal consciousness, as Roger or John or Mary. And as we settle on this presence, on this sense of existence, because the space has been created as the suffering quietens down, we can start to feel that I'm actually being lived by this consciousness, and that there is a connection to source, that what I am as a human being might not exist if this connection wasn't there. If the consciousness wasn't there, there would be no experience of the world. And so then there is a sense as we walk through life that I am always connected to source. And I use the word there is a sense. It's not something absolute. The sense of existence is undeniable. The sense of presence is undeniable. Now, on the other hand, though, is that sense of presence actually coming from source? There's the sense of that, but we don't know that absolutely. And at some point, you have to say, it doesn't really matter. What if it's actually generated within the body? Even if it was generated from within the body, it doesn't matter. It in itself is self-contenting. And so even the idea that there is a God or a source is a useful concept. And when push comes to shove, you will even happily not defend that concept. And yet, you might still enjoy and get pleasure out of feeling that what I am is connected to source. That's the sense. If someone said, can you prove that you're connected to source? One, I'd say, I don't need to prove it, I'm happy. Because of this connection to self, this awareness of the presence that I am. But I can tell you that the teaching that I came through that allowed awareness to land on that, put it in the context that that is the consciousness of source linked to a particular body, and it feels like that. But I don't hold that notion absolutely. What is most important is that the sense of presence is here. It's undeniable. And it's what allows us to live life peacefully. So looking at why the belief in doership can fall away, this is the concept that's put forward for investigation. It suggests that the human being in each moment is one way. Exactly the way that life has designed them to be, based on everything that came before. So biologically and psychologically, the person is essentially a biological instrument or vehicle based on two factors, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. Both of those factors put in place by life and not something that the individual controls. So the body creates a genetic structure, and then life from the moment of conception starts to condition that structure. And at any point in time, the human vehicle on a biological and psychological level is only one way. It has been tuned specifically to be the way it is in that moment. It can't be two ways in one particular moment. It can change so that it's different in the next moment, but in each moment it's only one way. And it finds itself in a circumstance that is very unique in itself, has very unique characteristics. There are lots of people or no people, and birds and trees and noises and cars maybe. Each circumstance is completely unique. And as a result of the circumstance and the unique tuning of the person, that wasn't something they were in control of, there is a reaction, a response to whatever is happening. A biological reaction and a psychological reaction. A psychological reaction when the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are in place, and when those have dissolved, then there is just a biological reaction in the moment and no psychological reaction. So it means the end of the psychological reaction means the end of suffering. The psychological reaction comes from the thinking mind, which is the part of the brain that has been conditioned with these beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. And the biological is part of the genetic makeup and the working mind, the functional mind. So in each moment, there is definitely a biological movement by the human, and very often a psychological movement. When the thinking mind dissolves, then just the biological movement remains. Now, when the doer inside of us hears this description, and it hears the notion of continuous unbroken peace of mind in daily living, one of the first things the doer says is, so how can I make this happen? How can I do it? So yesterday I got an interesting question in a discussion that highlights this point perfectly, and so I don't bring it up as a criticism. Actually, it just shows this is very much the natural, or not natural, but the human condition of doership. So how can I bring this understanding into my relationships in life? And when we look at it, we go back to the explanation that says, at any point in time, the human being is one way, the way that they are in that moment. Life has conditioned them and produced a genetic structure and then conditioned it exactly as it has up to that point in time. And so that means in your relationships, the body is going to react according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning. It can only react that one way. So the question that says, so how can I bring this understanding into my relationships, is a question that comes from the belief that I am a doer in each moment that can choose how to act. So it says, how can I bring this into my relationship? The answer is you can't bring it into your relationships. It will be there automatically if the body has been programmed by life for the belief in doership and attachment to have fallen away. Which means in that moment in your relationship, the reaction is going to be one where doership and attachment are not part of the circumstance, or not part of the overall experience. But if the body is still has the conditioning of doership and attachment to outcome, it is going to exist in your relationship. And so if we can come to see, which really means new conditioning, that this is the case, then when a reaction happens of guilt or blame or pride, expectation, which is suffering arising, a thought could arise, which is part of a result of our up-to-date conditioning, and it says, this is happening not because I as a doer have failed, but because the body is programmed in such a way for suffering to arise in this moment. And in the same way, this is not trying to make us perfect human beings. The understanding is not saying that we have to function biologically a perfect way. What it's hopefully trying to do is condition the body such that when we function imperfectly and produce outcomes that are not great, the thought arises and sees that as a happening. It says, I couldn't have acted differently in this moment. Now, this is useful in hindsight, This is useful after something has happened. It cuts off guilt and it cuts off blame, because we can say the same thing for the other. It's not useful to go forward with this before making decisions. We make decisions in each moment on the basis that I have choice in this moment. That's how life unfolds. Once we make a choice and the outcome is a certain way, we can look back on it and say that choice was based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So this way, this doesn't become an excuse where we go around living life saying everything is happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and therefore I'm going to be complacent or I'm going to be irresponsible. If those things happen, it is because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. But this explanation doesn't mean that in each moment we shouldn't do the best that we can. In a particular situation, do the best that you can. Doing the best that you can is simply the functioning of your body based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So if this explanation does get in the way, then that's destiny. If the thought does arise, well, it's all predetermined, so I might as well lie on the couch, then it is destiny for lying on the couch to be there based on your genes and your up-to-date conditioning, which includes this concept that maybe is being interpreted a little bit different to how it's intended.
Just about the labeling, I was thinking that also labeling create a separation, not only reinforce it, in a way it's the same thing, but for me labeling is also a coming back to the duality, reinforcing in it.
The coming back to the duality?
And give to the relative dual aspect of life more force when we label. You understand?
I do, but actually, you see, the thing is that we're not looking to live in non-duality. Separation is an attitudinal separation that is the issue, not a circumstantial separation. On the surface, life is always going to be duality. The experience, unless we start to manipulate the mind, which we can do, and then it gets tiring after a while. If we manipulate the mind, we can start to experience life on the surface as a non-duality. But that's not the natural functioning of the human being. It's not the natural functioning, it's a functioning of the human being that has been influenced by teaching, that has now actually covered up the seeing of what is in parts. It's very useful to create an awakening to something, but that's not how life is meant to be lived on an ongoing basis. It covers up the fact that the experience is designed and always will be designed to appear like an experience of time and space, cause and effect. And if we think that our happiness comes from some experiential non-separation, then what we're going to be doing is we're going to be waiting for experientially life to feel like it's all one. And because those events, those experiences do happen, there are oneness experiences, it further reconfirms to us in terms of our belief that we're looking for life to be oneness on an experiential level. And because we hear accounts of other people's oneness experiences, it confirms that what I'm looking for is to experience life as oneness on an experiential level. What we're really looking for is to understand that on a fundamental level, there is no separation. So if I can see that what I am is completely affected by everything that came before. Now, that means I am not separate from anything that happened previously, and I'm not separate from anything that is happening right now. I'm one with the environment, even if the experience is that there is separation, if the experience can be that there is space between me and the tree. But I know that because the tree is being perceived by me, it's at no distance from who I am, and it is part of my experience. So I am one with it, one with everything that is happening now, not separate from it, and yet the experience is that I am separate from the tree. So if I come to see that attitudinally, just attitudinally, there is no separation. So I then come to know myself not as a separate independent entity, but one that is always connected to the present moment, always affected by these factors which are conditioning me to act a particular way.
And this is very important in my way to think today, because you start to tell us that happiness is the absence of the sense of something missing. Can we say that the absence of the sense of something missing is the same to say the absence of the sense of lack?
Yes. Yeah.
And so this absence of the sense of missing, for me, it's directly connected to the sense of no separation. If I feel separate, so obviously I will feel myself incomplete. That's true?
If you attitudinally imagine yourself separate,
Yeah.
you will then feel separate. And so we are attitudinally, we've been conditioned to by life to feel like we are separate independent entities, autonomous human beings. And so when we hear that the answer is that there is no separation, our assumption is that this shift from separation to non-separation is going to be experiential, on the level of experience. So we're waiting for the experiential level to be one that shows me no separation. But it's not on the experience level that we feel disconnected and cut off. We feel disconnected and cut off because we feel like we are disconnected. Our imagination of what we are, not only our imagination, but our experience of what we are confirms that we are a separate entity. So because the experience confirms we're a separate entity, that's what the belief is. If the belief can dissolve and we can see on an attitudinal level we're not connected, we're not separate, then on the experiential level the separation can remain.
We can say that we are not separate from the source or from the intelligence which create instant after instant life through us. We
Yes.
can say that?
That's actually the connectedness that comes in is I'm always connected to source. the consciousness of source has linked to a particular body-mind organism and is functioning through that as Rogerness, Sophiness, and there is something very important in that consciousness that is functioning through us. It's the sense of existence. And so once we become aware of the sense of existence functioning through us, we then know that I'm not separate from that sense of existence.
So if this source decide to go through us in an pleasant aspect or in an unpleasant or painful aspect, when we see that this is what might happen, there is no more resistance, there is no more conflict, even if it's not our preference.
Yes, because once the connection to source has been established, meaning once awareness has landed on this very significant sense of presence, sense of existence, once it's landed on that, that even in the face of pain, that doesn't get covered up. And so then the pain doesn't essentially create a separation. Whereas the standard way of experiencing ourselves is to not be aware of our sense of existence, to be completely identified with the flow of life and be involved in the flow of life and find ourselves disconnected from what's inside. It's still there, but our attention is focused on the flow of life. And so when that's the case, even if life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure for a lot of the time, we'll still feel dissatisfied. Once this connection to self happens, which simply means awareness of something that has always been there, but something that hasn't been considered to be very relevant, coupled with the fact that the suffering, the involvement in what's happening in the flow of life covers it up. So because that hasn't been seen, there is this uncomfortableness with pleasure and pain, uncomfortableness with self that is triggered by the pleasure and pain in life. So the connection makes all the difference. The recognition of who I am, which happens when the beliefs in doership and attachment to outcome fall away, makes all the difference. Life can continue to be pleasurable and painful, and yet we find ourselves resting in our own being that is always complete. This sense of existence is never more or less. It's always full existence. The reason that it feels more or less is simply because awareness isn't fully grounded in it, or because suffering is filling the space and covering it up.
But I understand that we feel complete, or we might feel complete, because we recognize that we are an expression of this unlimited source. So because the essence of who we are is this unlimited and pure potential, so for this reason we feel complete. But at the same time, the fact that this unlimited source manifests itself through a limit body-mind, we can also have the experience of the limitness. There is this paradox. There is this unlimited source that we just can. We have this intuition of that, but when
No, we don't. We have a belief about that.
Well, but the sense of presence with this very. Yesterday, I had the feeling like there is a manifestation which take this aspect of human being, and in this human being experience, the most stable thing is the sense of being. Everything move around, change, but the sense of being just stay as it is all the time. So, but it's a relative aspect, but it's a more stable aspect in the relative manifestation. But we have the intuition, or how you say, we believe that this sense of being, very stable, comes from the unknown source. So this is give us the ability to say.
You see, but you said it when you started, that we feel complete because of the idea that we are connected to an unlimited source. And it's not the case. It's got nothing to do with an idea about what we are. It comes from the simple being or presence, existence that is here. It's self-contenting, which means we don't need to think about it. We need to be it. And when we are being it, there is no problem.
So, but this is cannot. My English is so bad. Okay, this sense of completeness might not reveal itself. Maybe in this life.
It may not. True.
Even if I know that I am, I can have the experience that
what do you
I
mean?
am not I am not complete.
What
I
this knowing that you are, what sort of knowing is it?
Well, I recognize this sense of being.
In experience.
Yes. So I can deny it. I can know that every time this sense of being, it's always the same, even if I am crossing different kind of experience. But the sense of being, since I remember, it's always the same.
So the reason why that's not satisfying, if there is an awareness of it, is that what you are aware of must be just an aspect of our being, meaning that certain mentation, certain thinking is present in the present moment, together with your awareness of this sense of being. Because in the absence of suffering, the sense of being, which really means living life as a human, it's nothing special, it means living life as a human, aware of your sense of existence, aware that I am as a human. So that and the absence of suffering mean that life, we are happy. There's nothing looked for in terms of no thinking about, well, what will it be like tomorrow? No looking back at the past. There is just the functioning of the human being doing whatever they need to do with no sense of uncomfortableness. So to the extent that you have recognized I am, but it doesn't satisfy, means that there is still the beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, which essentially means if I am the doer, I am a separate, independent entity. That's the belief, that I am functioning of my own volition, and that will create the fear. That will create the thinking that disturbs the present moment. So what's the solution? The solution is life reconditioning the body-mind organism so that the psychological thinking that has become standard, is a default, and therefore affects our experience in a way that is standard. The solution is for life to recondition such that that thinking no longer happens. And how does that happen? It happens by new conditioning being delivered in the form of, for example, satsang, that keeps pointing out that the problem is the obscuring of our connection to Source. And the obscuring of our connection to source is the belief I am the doer and the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Because my happiness to be found in outcomes means that I'm looking for myself out there. I'm looking for my completeness outside. The belief that I am the doer and the other is the doer means that my connection to source, or my sense of my own existence, is not fully recognized. So that's why this teaching is continually pointing at the fact that the more and more often we get to see in life that I am not the doer, the other is not the doer, and my happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, these beliefs start to shrink. They start to dissolve. And so every time that blame arises, which is blaming the other for what they have done that hurt me, based on seeing them as a separate individual entity in control of everything that they think, feel and do, every time that arises, hopefully a thought arises, this is a belief in doership. The other is not the doer. This blame is not an accurate assessment of life and the other. So the more that happens, the more it shows that the understanding of non-doership is taking hold. And each time it happens, it undermines the belief in doership. So our essence is always here. It's covered up. So the job is not to create the essence. The job is always to throw out what is covering up. And the good news is that we're not the ones that have that job. Life has that job. Life has the job by delivering new conditioning. And when life delivers new conditioning, the body-mind organism is affected by that new conditioning. And we don't decide how we're affected by it. We just get affected by it. So, this idea that how am I, I don't feel this sense of existence fully, or I still believe I'm the doer, and how do I get rid of this? That's still coming from the idea that there is someone that does something. We don't have a job to do. Life has the job of reconditioning us. And I can assure you, we're not in control of the massive flow of life. It's really great news. As soon as it clicks in the brain, which is part of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when it clicks in the brain, so when I say as soon as you realize this, I'm not talking about you as a doer, you as a separate independent entity. I'm talking about the clicking in the brain based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. It says, of course, I've never created who I am. Life has created who I am, and life continues to change and create me new each moment. And so it's up to life to deliver the changes that are required. I'm off duty. As soon as you do that, that is a deep recognition of non-doership. It means life has done already what it's meant to be doing. Not what it's meant to be doing, what would lead to the end of suffering. So to the extent someone says, I don't have a job to do because I'm not the doer. I've never had a job to do because I've never been the doer. Everything that has been happening to this body has been happening because life has been impacting it. Life has always been making me. And I've always been automatically functioning, not by my doership, but by my biology and my psychology, exactly the way I've been designed. And it's like, I never have a job to do in life. And even with this understanding, I don't have a job to do in life, the body still functions. It still wakes up and goes to the toilet. It still feels hungry, so it gets food. It receives a bill in the mail, so it says, I better go to work.
So when you are looking from the space of being in your peace of mind and happiness is there, and life delivers pain, is it less painful?
No, pain is always the same. What happens is with the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, the pain experience is experienced as the pain plus the psychological load of suffering on top of that. And when we believe that pain is an attack on who we are, the basic pain is what is delivered, and then that resistance to the pain intensifies the experience significantly. So where the experience changes drastically is where our resistance to the pain and our idea, our ingrained belief about what that means about me falls away. And so experientially we would, if we weren't looking at it in fine detail, we would say, wow, pain reduces significantly. But actually the pain is always the same, and it's not such a big deal. It's our attitudinal relationship to the pain that is most uncomfortable.
So it would be like this horizontal pain, no vertical pain, and not horizontal pain.
Well, there isn't any horizontal pain. So pain is always vertical, and then the suffering is horizontal. But because the pain and the suffering exist essentially simultaneously when there is this belief system in the body, we never really, even in the vertical movement, we don't really experience pain on its own. Because as soon as the pain arises, the attachment to it is there. And so we experience pain plus the load of suffering, the resistance to it. And that resistance to it can extend much longer than the circumstance itself. So we can have a painful circumstance that lasts 5 minutes, and then the thinking about it can go on for days or weeks, years. And that's the load of suffering that carries on.
Yeah, because it's like you kind of get trained that if you could figure it out, you could help it from happening again. And so you can kind of get tricked into like, if I could just figure out how this happened, I could sidestep it next time. And it's an error, obviously, compared to what you're teaching, that it's just a happening.
It's all, yeah. But as I said, that life can recondition us in each moment. And we will act differently. And so the act of seeing what caused a negative outcome can become part of our up-to-date conditioning. But the fact is that the seeing of it is going to happen, or it's not going to happen, whether you, as a doer, are trying to insist, I have to see this. It's going to happen whether you insist on, I have to see it or not. Or I have to see it. It'll still be seen or not seen. It's not going to be seen just because you insist, I have to see it. Simply understanding that a recognition of dynamics is important, that is now part of your up-to-date conditioning that recognizes that. If it's recognized and then the doer says, so I have to do this, then that's the doer coming in.
Okay, and one last question was, when you said earlier about the uncomfortableness in the body and seeking, I thought if you might have mentioned the uncomfortableness another time, but I was thinking first there's the uncomfortableness, then the seeking starts, or are they the same?
The uncomfortableness is not a physical uncomfortableness, just so we're clear. It's this sense of uncomfortableness with oneself on a level of self, and it's based on the deeply ingrained beliefs in the system that are there based on how past events have been related to. So it's sort of like this false identity that emanates out a radiation of uncomfortableness. Just simply being in life can trigger the fears and the sense of lack and the sense of all of the attachment to outcomes and doership that's locked away in the body. And then that uncomfortableness automatically, it's not really a separation, they're one and the same thing. The uncomfortableness included in it comes up with a answer. It says this is the answer to this uncomfortableness. The thing we need to recognize is that the uncomfortableness is based on an error about who we are and what life is. And the answer that comes up in the uncomfortableness, the answer says, when you get this, everything will be okay. Or, I need to solve this problem, and then everything will be okay. Or, I need to find a soulmate, then everything will be okay. All of those answers that come up are in themselves errors. They're not true answers. They're the answers that the doership and attachment to outcome present. And so that's why we're driven to seek for a whole lot of things that are not what we're actually looking for. So this new conditioning is pointing at the root of the uncomfortableness, the doership and attachment to outcome, showing that whatever we do in each moment, whatever the other does in each moment, is part of the story of life, destined. Or if we want to look at it causally, based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning that we're not in control of. And the more that this is seen, the more that the ingrained beliefs at the root of our uncomfortableness fall away. And if that falls away, the answers that it was providing to us fall away, and we find ourselves not seeking in the wrong place, which means our attention tends to drop back inwards and towards us, which is where we find, I am. Could it be that my happiness is simply resting in my own presence?
Thank you. So, you mentioned at the beginning about these beliefs that we pick up in life that get in the way, and one of them, after awakening, was about that my happiness is found in the thought-free state. And I really took that belief on. I thought, yeah, my peace is found when there's no thinking. And often you can drop in and there can be no or limited thinking. So that's one of my deeper beliefs, which I see now as a mistake, but it's there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that one, the next one was to do with the idea that there's no person. So you pick up, but in the sense of, I never really picked that belief up, but what it did was made me again, in the mind, certain thoughts might then continue this war against themselves and say, well, is that thought a person thought, or what, like this. So that continued, it impacted upon the first belief. And then I guess maybe with the new concepts of the working mind and the thinking mind, again, we've got a third concept on top, which is more food for thought, that one part of the mind says, is that the thinking mind or is this the working mind, etc.
Mm.
So I understand that the principle, of course, is to be at peace with the flow of life, which includes thinking and but I noticed this, it doesn't always come up, but it often comes up. And it often comes up early in the morning, or if I wake up in the middle of the night, I find that the mind is churning on this conundrum.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what can free up this incorrect belief.
It's very, to me, it's important to see why various teachings put these methodologies forward, and that what I've just said in itself is part of the answer. Is that a teaching putting forward a methodology? That's what a teaching is. It's a methodology to achieve what needs to be achieved. It isn't truth. That's the problem, is that we tend to, as human beings, believe anything new that we resonate with. And then we say, the old stuff wasn't true, but this is true. And a teaching actually relies on that. That's how this process works. But at some point, it's very great for us to come and see teachings and methodologies. And so even if two teachings deliver different methodologies, if we understand that they're methodologies, and there could be very many different methodologies that are needed to undo either the same problem but in different ways, or different methodologies to undo different problems. And so some teachings are good at undoing certain obstacles, and then other teachings good at undoing other obstacles. So if we can come to see teachings this way, and even see how they're working on us, and how they have worked on us, and how now something new is important, then understanding the process has a big effect on the process. So one of the very common misconceptions is that enlightenment or happiness or peace, actually enlightenment, because the happiness and the peace are more introduced in few teachings. But so coming to know your true nature maybe would be, or enlightenment. And often we hear it's the end of thinking. I'm just trying to think in no mind in some forms of Buddhism, I think. And why is that said? And the reason is that suffering, it's a bit like the approach that we spoke about earlier, that says don't label anything as pleasure and pain. They're different teachings, but they're working on the same principle, and recognizing that suffering is mental, and recognizing that the suffering is about an attitude to the flow of life, an attitude of attachment to the flow of life. Because that attachment is so ingrained, what the process sometimes does is try to actually cut off the thinking that includes, or that is, the attachment. So it will encourage no thinking. Because if there's no thinking, then there can't be any judgment or attachment, because we keep cutting it off. And so it may start off by saying that, happiness is, or the problem is thinking. When thinking stops, there's no problem. And I'd agree, except I think it's so crucial to have to bring in this notion of the working mind and the thinking mind. Because when we hear that thinking is the problem, and that when thinking stops, that's a revelation of your true self, or that's, the false self now having stopped, it gives the impression that all thinking is a problem. It gives an impression that all thinking is the false self. Whereas some thinking will carry on in life. It has to carry on in life. We can't function without thought. So certain thoughts that are functional are not at all the problem. So once we introduce this notion of the thinking mind and the working mind, we can then say the thinking mind is the problem. The thinking mind needs to cease. That way, when the working mind functions, we don't look at it and go, oh, problem. Whereas when we hear that thinking has to stop, because thinking is the problem, we will look at a thought that says, I wonder what time I should order the taxi to get me to the airport on time. And we think, oh, you shouldn't think. Thinking shouldn't be there. I have to have an empty mind, no mind. And then if that's the belief that gets put in place, we're going to be dissatisfied, thinking that we haven't achieved what needs to be achieved every time the working mind functions. And when we look at it, the working mind doesn't cause any problem regarding our happiness. It's always the thinking mind, the suffering, that causes the problem. So, I think some teachings don't bring in this nuance because it figures it's just going to give more concepts to a mind that grabs hold of concepts. So let's be more rudimentary in our approach, and let's start to try and undo the attachment by starving the mind of anything to think about. And it can work. I know I found it as part of my process, but then that can be refined. And so that's a very valid teaching, and then the refinement of it is valid at a certain point in time. So this notion of the working mind and the thinking mind is crucial. The thinking mind is any thinking that is based on I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so the thinking mind produces guilt, blame and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. All of that is the product of the thinking mind based on these false beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. And so any time that the thinking mind kicks up, we can recognize it as an uncomfortableness inherent in all of those different forms of thinking: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. There is an uncomfortableness because there is a sense that life is not fine as it is, which really means that there is a non-recognition of our completeness. So whenever the thinking mind kicks up, that's the problem. That's the problem for our happiness. But we also need to, as part of the working mind, the functional mind needs to realize, if I resist the thinking mind, because I've been told and come to see that the thinking mind is the problem, if I resist suffering, that resistance is actually more suffering. It is the thinking mind resisting something that is just happening. So that's a nuance that's a bit tricky, but once we become clear on all the different forms of the thinking mind, we start to catch the more clever functioning of the thinking mind out. So your thought, your belief was that it's about the end of thinking, and that there is no person here. And the reason that the teachings come in and say there is no person is because our idea of who we are is I am the person, the body, and this is the important part, attached to that idea I am the person, not only am I the person, but I am a person who is a separate, independent entity in control of all of their thoughts and all of their emotions, all of their actions. And so when a teaching says there is no person, what it's saying is that there is no separate independent entity. That's a fiction. That there is a doer. And because our definition of person is a person that is a doer, the teaching says there is no person. And the teaching that keeps pointing out there is no person will show you there is just thought arising in the present moment. There is just movement arising in the present moment. And saying there is no one doing that. And at some point there'll be an awakening to the fact that, wow, in the present moment there is just experience, and the thought is an object in experience, the body is an object in experience, the emotion is an object in experience, and there is no thinker of the thought, no person creating the emotion. When we see this, we go, of course, there is no person. And then we go around saying there is no person and believing there is no person. What's more accurate is there is a person. The experience of a human being is still here. Because when we see it, we deconstruct the experience in a sense to see that all of these things are just objects in the present moment. So we come to see there is no independent, real entity, the person. And so in the deconstructed phase, when all the bits are like taking a motor apart and you've got all the different bits there, you go, wow, there is really no independent person. The problem is we can keep relating to life in its deconstructed form. Life is meant to be lived when it's reconstructed. And so when it's reconstructed, we come back to the experience. And the experience is, oh yes, here I am. So what is this? I go, it's a person. I'm a person. But now I realize I'm a person that is very different to my definition of person before. My definition of person before was a separate independent entity in control because of their own volition. Now I see, oh, there is a person, but they're not a separate doer. So the person remains. We are the ego. We are the person. We were the person before this realization and will be the person after the realization. It's just that before the realization, there was the strong belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So there was a person with the strong belief in doership and attachment to outcome, which meant our essence was obscured. After this process, there is still the person, but no longer with the belief in personal doership, which essentially means separation, and no longer with the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So we have a person that doesn't believe themselves to be the doer. And as a result, there is awareness of the essence of the person, the core of the human being that wasn't there before. So these teachings will tell us a whole lot of things along the way that are necessary to step us to this final standpoint where we stop believing that there is no person. We stop believing a whole lot of things that we had to believe. We stop believing I am awareness, which is a big one. We stop believing I am not the body. Teachings told us that for a good reason, in order for those aspects of life that were not recognized to be recognized. And once they're recognized, hopefully these concepts that we've believed get shown, and come on, it's a bit of a slap across the face. You know, you keep going around saying your awareness. You're believing a concept that you were told, and now there's this human being that keeps going around denying their complete human beingness. It's actually a form of delusion. But it was needed. And after you get slapped across the face a few times and you realize, wow, I'm a human being exclaiming that I am awareness. Whereas what the teaching is really, what was really was doing was getting us to see the awareness component, so that I can go around exclaiming, I'm a human, but the core of me is awareness. And this life plays tricks with us. It puts in place a teaching, like top-down, esoteric, non-dual teachings that sound so radically profound, because they are, and they are delivered as if coming to recognize awareness is the ultimate. Whereas actually it's just a step to recognize awareness, and then to come back and say, oh, I am the human, which includes the body, and it includes awareness as something functioning through the body, or part of the integral human. So from that point of view, we can see that the realization of awareness is actually a stepping stone. It's a necessary part. But it's delivered in the teaching as though it's the absolute, the be all and end all. And that's not a fault of the teaching. The teaching says, well, I need this to be seen, so let me make it the be all and end all. And then it will get seen, which it does, it gets seen. Then we need to discredit the teaching, in a sense. So because of the way we see it, and we see sages like Nisargadatta, whose job in life was to point at this awareness aspect, and so because that's his job, he will keep saying, I am not the body. I am this aspect that no one is seeing. I'm trying to get you to see it. I'm trying to get you to look away from your obsession with the gross, the objective, the body, which everyone is aware of. I'm trying to tell you that's not important. I'm not that. I'm awareness. And then when we see it, because we still have a relationship with the teachings as being this absolute truth, we go around for a long time not fully recognizing what we actually are, the human being, and the core of the human being is awareness. Now, earlier on I was talking about this presence, this existence. Existence and awareness don't ever exist separately. They always coexist. So the recognition of awareness and the sense of existence is essential. And then the recognition that this awareness and the sense of existence don't ever exist independent of the body. Except sometimes in some meditations and things like that, which can be very useful to allow us to become aware of the awareness and the sense of existence. But when we stop practicing exercises and we just say, here, okay, I've had enough of all of this manipulation of daily life experience, and I'm just going to relax. We come back and we find, oh, I'm the human being. So that's how we have to live. But now with the recognition of this awareness and the sense of existence, which allow us to know that in this moment, I am complete. We know it not because of some intellectual, we know it because we can rest in the complete humanness. We can be a complete aware of our humanness in its complete sense, meaning aware of being human with this core that is self-satisfying.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you. I guess I just want to add that in re-establishing my connection to my thoughts, my thinking, of course thoughts arise spontaneously, so you see through that, it's not me doing the thinking, of course, we all very familiar with that. But even to claim my thinking and my thoughts is something I guess I've struggled to do in recent times. So,
well, can I because it's a good point. So, in case you were going somewhere else, I'd rather just jump in here. So once we can, when we have trouble saying something like my, it's part of the process whereby it's really going deeper and deeper, the recognition that it's not mine as a separate entity, but they're happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning is one way of saying it, or they just happen inside consciousness, but in my mind. Let's say that the thoughts just arise in the mind. But when we look at what thoughts just arise, actually, if you haven't denied the body, because in that process you might have denied the body as being anything to do with you, so then that's why we say the thoughts just arise out of nothing. But if we're able to integrate the existence of the body, we'll see that the thoughts arise very much correlated with the makeup of the body. You tend not to have just random thoughts about things that are completely unrelated with the body, but you have thoughts that are relevant with the body's experience. So then we can come to see that the thoughts are an output of the body, which is always created by life, not by me. So what we're saying here is that there is no me as a doer that creates the thoughts. But once that's become really ingrained, so we've repeated over and over again where we can't even say me or my or I, which is just part of the ingraining that they're not as personal as I used to take them. Once that's clear, then we can introduce the word mine, my thoughts, in such a way that it doesn't mean what it used to mean. It doesn't mean me as a separate, independent entity. Now we're saying my thoughts, yes, they're not the chair's thoughts, they're the thoughts of Roger, but not Roger's creation, not Roger as a separate, independent doer. So then we can start functioning again and communicating in life normally. Yes, I did this, I did that, but our own internal understanding is it was a happening through me and couldn't have happened any other way. It was a happening through me based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I found myself in. But instead of finding some very elaborate new language, we go back to the language and say, I did this, I went to the shops, realizing that what was happening is life was happening and the body was moving to the shops based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning or based on destiny. But for all practical purposes, I live as if I am Roger. So then I can say, yes, I can start using the word me and mine and I and you. All the personal pronouns come back in, but they don't have this doership attached to them.
Do you think then in such a situation as this, where you've been through this mishmash of teachings and this journey of understanding, do you think you could reintroduce a new concept like I love my thinking or beautiful thinking, that idea, to counteract the kind of element of the mind which is negative towards it, or do you think that's unnecessary or dangerous?
That's what teaching concepts tend to do, is they will introduce an opposite concept to something in the mind that is problematic. And at the end, both of them fall away. So if we can go to a point of not calling it one or the other, and just allowing it to be thoughts, because the judgment of the thoughts is the thinking mind, is the doership. So to the extent that we could just allow it to be, then we don't need to introduce an opposite concept. If there is a judgment of thinking, the concept that I would introduce is not beautiful thinking, but rather, so the judgment might be suffering might arise, and then we might say, why do I still have these judgment thoughts or these blame towards the other? And the issue there is the doership in the thought. So I would introduce the concept, it's a happening, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, not your doing, so not something you can control. It will always be according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning. So in seeing it that way, we allow the blame to be there as a happening. And what is going on there is that the non-doership understanding is now kicking in on the outer level, where it recognizes the blame, which includes doership in it. It recognized the blame as not my doing. So that can be, that's a great thing, is that the witnessing of the blame as a happening happens, which means the understanding of non-doership is happening on this level, which means eventually it's going to penetrate to the level of the blame. Whereas if we are blaming ourselves for blaming, there is doership on the outer level and on the inner level. There's doership on the guilt for blaming, and there's doership in the blame itself. So if we think that the doership in the blame is going to dissolve when we're still blaming ourselves for blaming, it's a non-recognition of the problem. So the understanding of non-doership has to come in on the outer levels first.
Thank you.
Yes.
Question about the first part of your answer about oneness teaching or the awareness teaching. I was wondering if to cut off too early this type of teaching, cut off their power. Like Ramana Maharshi would say, in order to see where you are in the process, just look at your thinking. And if my thinking is still believed, means that it's still going on, so it's quite active. So maybe it's not time to cut off the oneness or consciousness teaching.
Yes, if you were cutting off what is going to uproot the thinking, then there's a problem. When we look at the thinking that Ramana Maharshi is talking about when he says, look at your thinking, he's really saying, look at the thinking, and when you look at it, you'll find the problematic thinking is based on blame and guilt and pride, worry, anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. That's the small self, the self with the small s. It's the doer that believes that happiness is to be found in, out there, that doesn't recognize its completeness here. So oneness is one way of undermining that thinking. The other way is to undermine the basis of that thinking. So if we have an awakening, the awakening actually only serves in order to offer us a recognition of life from a different perspective that then allows that thinking to dissolve. And if we don't, when there's an awakening and we don't see the implication of what is seen in the awakening, we don't see the implication as to how it affects that thinking specifically, i.e. on the level of believing myself to be a separate entity that is dependent on outcomes, then the awakening doesn't really serve much purpose. At best, it serves as a temporary state that you can find yourself in, a state that you're pulled out of as soon as life is painful and the thoughts and the beliefs of doership kick into action. And so in that teaching, it would be, if that happens, witness the thoughts again, without necessarily talking about what is at the base of the thoughts. Just come back to witnessing. And in time, once we rest as the witness and know ourselves as something less, know ourselves at our core as something not just limited to the biological, we'll start to get the sense that what I am and these stories that are going on are not congruent. So the stories will then slow down on their own. But what we're talking about here, doership and attachment to outcomes, is looking directly at the stories. It doesn't actually require a realization of oneness in order for what's at the root of those stories to be undone. So oneness teachings and doership teachings are actually two different methodologies that overlap significantly, because they're really both undermining the same root, but doing it in different ways. So if I were to cut off, if someone was on the oneness path and this teaching was introduced, I'm not particularly concerned about is it too premature, because it offers an alternative. If it didn't offer an alternative, then we'd have to be, concerned. What is particularly beautiful, I think, because it was my path of first going through the oneness top-down teachings and having the awakenings, and when these other explanations come in, they're supported by that way of seeing life. So the two together, the witnessing of life from formless awareness perspective and the explanations of non-doership, are completely complementary. So there's no reason why the two can't work simultaneously. And that's what I would hope happens.
Beautiful, thank you.
At this moment, I have the feeling that all this talk, all this concept, all this paradox, put me in a way of doing something. Like I have to do understand, and somewhere I know it's not the good way, but I am there.
Mm-hmm. So the doer in us, the belief in doership, as soon as it hears a description of life, which is what these are descriptions of life, but as soon as the doer hears that, it takes them as prescriptions of what it has to understand, what it has to achieve, what it has to do. And so that's one of the reasons why other teachings give very little conceptual explanation, because this is understood to be the case. And so it just tells someone, for example, you have nothing to do, which this teaching is also saying, but it's not necessarily heard by the doer. So why the conceptual explanations can be delivered in quite a lot of detail is because the teaching itself simultaneously is always saying, but you don't do any of this. These are just descriptions, not prescriptions. And so if we find the doer kicking in, it will feel uncomfortable, because the doer is trying to get things to happen now. And it will start to feel uncomfortable because it might not see the results. It might not understand what it's meant to be achieving or what it's meant to be understanding or doing. And hopefully the uncomfortableness, coupled with the fact that, as we've spoken about over the last few days, we should use the sense of uncomfortableness as a guide of what to look at and see what is going wrong. We'll find, this uncomfortableness is there because I'm trying to make this happen. And then the thought might kick in, or an answer will be given. That's what the doer is doing when it is hearing these descriptions and turning it into a big job that it has to achieve. And so as soon as it's seen, it can be, stop. And that's the thinking mind being recognized as the thinking mind, which is never helpful. It only creates suffering. And then the working mind says, stop. And it stops. And then you find yourself, back here again. That's better. Nothing to do. Why is there nothing to do? Because just being in life is the work being done. Being in life is life reconditioning us. Now, for a lot of people, being in life means being engaged in achieving. And for us, being in life means being in satsang. And so life is delivering. It's doing the work now. It's delivering the new conditioning now. You can go to sleep. You can just close your eyes and trust that life is impacting the body exactly as it needs to be impacted. This doesn't even need to be understood with the head.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, back to the pain idea. If you are resting in I am and something painful happens and it pulls you out of the I am, seemingly, but yeah, you're back into the, does that just basically say that you're still attached to outcome?
Yes, essentially, that's what that is evidence of. And that's not a problem. That's just how the body-mind is conditioned at that point in time. So if we see that painful circumstance happens, and then guilt and blame arise, and expectation of it being different arise, then the working mind can understand, that's just evidence that attachment to outcome and doership is still in the system. Hopefully that working mind, which now, if it's seeing that just as evidence of something, which is useful just to see it as evidence, hopefully the working mind realizes nothing to do about that. If I resist that, then that's more suffering.
So that's when you witness you just witness that's evidence that there's still ingrained belief in doership or attachment to outcome.
Yeah, and then you witness the blame. And if you're witnessing the blame, you might find you drop back into I am again.
But one question, she asked if the pain takes you out of the I am, right? So if the pain takes you out of the I am, but there's not necessarily suffering, it might be just because like you're resting in being and there's a painful situation and you just need to deal with it, right? So it might just be the working mind trying to sort something out.
Yes, there is a presupposition in your question, because it's actually, when you look at it, it's part of how you've been conditioned now by spiritual teachings, and is the assumption is that it's this spacious witnessing that is where we need to be as a state, that we need to be in all the time. And actually, you have to look at the fact that may actually be escaping being with life. Right? Because once the resting in being has been established, and it starts off as a resting in being, sometimes as a result of a dropping into a witnessing where the body sense tends to fall away, and it can be very peaceful. It's very nice. It can start as that, but at some point life is going to move us back into being in the body while still connected to the sense of existence. And so the sign of attachment to outcome is not necessarily the sign of drifting, coming out of that state of witnessing, because we can come out of the state of witnessing and come into the body, and that's actually where we want to live from. So coming into the body is not attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome is the arising of guilt and blame and resistance. So I would rephrase what you say. It's not being dragged out of I am as a state. In fact, come back in to the body as often as possible and experience life from there, and realize that I can be in the body and I am at peace as long as thoughts of guilt and blame and pride, expectation, attachment to outcomes aren't arising. And when they are arising, then we can say, oh, now I've become identified as the doer and attached to outcomes. So essentially I'm saying it's not really about a state. I am is not about a impersonal, spacious, formless being state. You can very much be attached, very much connected to I am, while being completely experiencing yourself as the body.
But like in order to get to this feeling of understanding yourself,
Is that on? Yeah, the green light's on, yeah.
in order to get to the understanding of it being in your body,
Mm-hmm.
then being in the spaciousness can help, I found. But I don't know if that's, like, can you just let it flow? So like if you're pulled out, you're out, and then you pull back in, you're in, and you just don't have a judgment. You just don't resist, just flow with it and just try not to think about it too much. Or?
Yeah, but this notion of coming back into the body as being a problem, that's what, when we're identified with the body and then there's this opening where we can rest in witnessing, we assume, oh, that's liberation. Actually, liberation is living in the body. It's just coming back into the body whereby all of the doership has been cleaned out. So the witnessing is a place where there's peace, because in a sense we've disconnected from the body and connected to the essence of who we are, which is great. That needs to be seen. But to think that the answer is to abide and hang out in witnessing for our whole life, at some point will become a bypassing. And we'll know when it is. So the same witnessing at the beginning is about a realization of self, a recognition of the formless essence that functions through the body, that is part of the complete human, an integral part of the human experience. And then at some point, it flips into being a bypassing and no longer helpful, and eventually life is going to drag us back into the body by telling us, actually, you're meant to live your life in the body, you're not meant to live your life out there. That was just a phase so that you could become aware of the formless awareness, so that there is some experiential recognition that what I am is not just the physical, because identification with outcomes includes the belief what I am is just the physical. So we need to have some other resting place to go to, some understanding that there is another resting place. And that resting place, or an understanding of that resting place, delivers the capacity for a thought to arise that says, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. We know that because we've rested in our being and found that there is peace in that being. And so that becomes part of the evidence for us to become convinced my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. The problem is my attachment to outcomes. And so while the attachment to outcomes is still in place, first we need to work on the attachment. When I say we work on it, our genes and up-to-date conditioning start catching out the attachment when it arises and not believing it to be true. Whereas in the past, there was no information that had categorized all of the guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation as anything, as an error. In the past, it hasn't been categorized as an error. In the past, we've related to this as completely justifiable because of what the other person did to us. Now we're being told, no, that's actually our suffering. And it's based on an error, misinterpretation of life and self. And when it arises after that conditioning has come in, it starts to be seen as an error. It starts to be cut off. It doesn't get cut off straight away. Even once we understand it as an error, it can be deeply ingrained, so it can hang around. And that's where we need to understand that it's hanging around is also just a happening. So we can relax and say, yeah, on the outside level, I know doership and attachment is not true, and not just intellectually, but I'm just witnessing the blame when it arises, which is non-doership in action. It's not criticizing oneself for blaming. It's saying, yeah, this is just what's happening at the moment.
So the witnessing then has its place, and you can never really come out of the I am because that's your essence. So feeling that you're coming out or being pulled out is a resistance to losing a state.
Yes. When you say you can never be pulled out of I am, in effect you can because of what covers it up. But actually we always are. So we're never not. We're never not. But certain thinking covers it up. And so if we think that we need to remain as I am as a state, and then finding that we get pulled out of that state, it is exactly that. If we suffer because of that, if we insist on that state being there all the time, it's just an attachment to that state, which isn't the only way that our beingness can be understood or recognized. It can be very much experienced in the body, and to the extent we come in the body and it's not experienced, it means there's stuff that needs to be seen, so we better hang out here a bit longer.
So when the sages say, remain in the I am or abide in the I am, and that's how you'll find your freedom, or whatever, how they put it.
Mm-hmm.
I've taken it to mean that you stay in the witnessing, and that's why I'm getting frustrated if I'm pulled out of it. So like, hey, maybe I was just about to get my freedom. So now I just misunderstood the whole thing.
So if you see that it's a teaching methodology, so the instruction, abide in I am, is there to allow us to see that it exists. And so maybe it doesn't apply that abiding in I am is the absolute answer. It's not in my in what I put forward is that there's a time and a place to fully feel the uncomfortableness that starts coming up once we've found this place of witnessing. Now a whole lot of uncomfortableness starts to come up. And so at some point we need to hear that it's not only witnessing that we need to do, because if we just remain in the I am, what tends to happen is it comes up and then it dissolves. And we think that this dissolving is great. That's what, it's all illusory. It's coming up and it's dissolving. The root, however, isn't being dissolved. So at some point we need to come in and feel what is coming up, not witness it. And so it's about a movement that we don't choose in a particular day. It will just happen one way or the other. But it won't happen if we haven't heard that there is merit in value in feeling. Because what you've said is correct. We've heard abide in I am. So that sounds like, well, I just have to not feel. I have to just witness. the abide in I am is saying that's needed. We need to become aware of this I amness, this existence. And so there are certain suggestions that help that happen. And we take it absolutely. And then another teaching comes in and says, yes, as well as that, sometimes we need to completely be overtaken by the feeling and express what hasn't been expressed before. Allow what was locked away because we didn't have the capacity to see it as just a happening. Allow it to come up and be felt. And if it comes up and is felt when this other understanding of non-doership is in place, it then gets released. It gets undone.
So then, once you become pretty familiar with that witnessing and the things start to come up, because witnessing can be like an act of suppression too, or escape, like you said, right? So when those things start to come up, then to honor the feelings is you put words to the feelings and you feel them, which means like hang out in your body. You mean like feel your sensations and let it just basically do what it could have yet if this space had been around when it initially happened, but you couldn't do it then or something.
Well, no, what you'll feel is the emotion that has no space in it. So what you will feel is the complete hatred, the complete shame. And because we've heard enlightenment is the end of all of these things, sometimes when they come up, we think, oh, I better not exhibit any of that. But that's it. That's what's locked away, the load of guilt and shame from the past and blame and hatred from the past. That's it trying to come up to be released out of the system. And so if we think, oh, I can't feel shame and guilt and blame and hatred, I need to avoid it at all cost. That's preventing it from coming up out of its suppressed locations. And so to hear, oh, I know myself as the witness, and I now also need to allow these energies to come out, which means I can't hang out as the witness because they won't come out then. So at some point we'll wake up and we'll feel overwhelmed with a sense I can't do anything, I can't face the world, let's say. And so don't kick into action and go into your normal defense strategy that says, yes, you can face the world, jump out of bed, and just, after 100 steps, you'll be okay. That also is valid for something different to what we're talking about here. In this moment, life might want you to feel completely overwhelmed, and then the energy might get stronger and stronger, and you might find yourself collapsing further, surrendering into the energy, which means it can be expressed fully. And at the same time, this understanding of non-doership, either during the expression of it or after, we'll say, wow, you see, that was all energy locked away based on the past, whereby the attitude was one of doership and attachment to outcome, and an attitude to events that happened. Doership and attachment to outcome. And so now it was just allowed to come through as an energy, and it's not taken personally.
And then there's more space inside your body, or there's more groundedness in your body to be able to feel grounded in the I am in your body versus
Yes.
out in witnessing.
Yeah, so it's
Okay.
a cleaning out of the basement,
Oh, okay.
which is sort of a messy job for a little while, but it creates space that's well needed.
All right, thanks.
Just-
We'll have these last two questions, and then
Just to continue with Annette's question, when life allowed this bubbling up of an old stuff which is suffering, and so you say you just to feel it, or do you think it's necessary to put also to understand the story there is behind that?
Well, if you really feel it, meaning feel it means allow it to flower. So it means allowing the shame, if it's shame, to become more and more shameful, the feeling. And then you might put words on it, like, I'm such a failure. I never respect myself. And whatever the words are, and that I expect it's not just words that you're thinking. This is a intense energy coming up. So I would expect lots of crying and lots of expression of a super intense energy. This is an energy that is so intense it has the capacity and it has been the filter through which we've been seeing life. So it's about letting this intense energy come up and telling us what it is. So that means the crying, the words will tell us what the energy has in it. So I'm saying, if you have a recorder as an analogy and you recorded everything that came out in the energy, and you listened to what was being recorded and what you were saying, then you'd hear the story in the energy. You don't need a recorder because you have the first-hand experience of the energy coming up, the shame or whatever. And so afterwards, you won't go, wow, I didn't realize that I had so much self-condemnation. You'll only know that after you see it. And it's not much good having seen it a year ago and saying, I know how much self-condemnation I have. It's about really seeing it every time it wants to come up. Now, if we just had to keep feeling everything, it would go on forever. Maybe. I think that the energies are limited, but even if they're limited, they'll just keep recycling if we didn't have a certain understanding. If we don't have a certain understanding on our conscious level of non-doership and non-attachment, then these energies would come up and we would express them, but they wouldn't get released. So they'd get expressed, and actually then it could intensify the feeling about that event and get locked away, and so it will keep coming up and recycling round and round and round. But if there is a deep understanding of the non-doership of life, the happening of life, then these energies can come up, be expressed, and automatically the understanding will be applied to them. And we could say, wow, I didn't realize that there was so much self-condemnation, which really means so much belief that I was a failure, I was the doer, and I failed at life. I failed in that event. It was my fault. So it comes up as shame, and then the understanding just atones it, just allows it to be transformed, released. And sure, there might be a lot, but it's limited, especially if it's being atoned. And it gets atoned by our understanding that life is putting in place now.
So in this case, we can say maybe that our understanding is like a therapist.
Yes,
in a way.
Like an antibiotic. Yes.
It's like this therapist space we offer to ourselves.
Yes, but let's be careful what we say by therapy, because what therapy is in most cases in life, the therapy we go to, doesn't ever talk about you're not the doer.
No, of sure.
Right?
No.
So this is it's like a therapist, if you want. But
a non-dual therapist.
But it's your wisdom.
Yeah.
You know, it's the real recognition of the nature of life. And it's really getting to the root of the problem. So there's a place for therapy as it exists in life, but to mistake this as just therapy, actually this is undoing the root of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, there is space for therapy as it is now, because it allows us to investigate very contracted energies, and that can create some more space.
Thank you.
Yeah, just if you've got like a headache or pressure behind the eyes and these kind of sensations, they're not I wouldn't necessarily say they're emotionally based sensations. Would you see that as pain in the moment, or not part of suffering, or could it be?
So that would be, for me, that's part of the circumstance. If you have a headache, or even like a meditation type headache where your head feels like it's full of concrete, is a particular sensation that is common. It's just like if you have heart palpitations, it's circumstantial, and it's pain in the moment. It will be turned into suffering if there is the doer comes in and says, why is this like this? It shouldn't be like this. I'm not doing something right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.